Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you for our latest edition of our weekly podcast that we love to do. And I'm looking forward to this one today because it's a topic which, yes, people are talking a lot about, but I still find it super interesting, and that's around AI. But actually, it's the impact for HR professionals. And there's a really interesting report I came across. I think it was HR Magazine, or it might have been People Management, that some of our friends at Vizia have written. And it's called Managers Know AI Tools Make Them More Effective. Can HR Deliver? And I read it and I thought, I need to speak to somebody at Vizia about this because this is fascinating. And so I have two wonderful guests with me. I've got Andrea Derla, who is Principal Research and Value at Vizia. How are you doing, Andrea? You all right?
I'm great. Thank you for having us. Glad to be here.
Great to have you on. And Ben Harris, who is the VP of Sales EMEA at Vizia. Ben, how are you doing?
I'm great, Chris. Great to be here.
Great to have you on. We're going to get into the details of this report, but it would be remiss of me not to hit you guys with our fundamentally different question, which is completely non-HR and random and normally based on something that I've read which made me chuckle during the week. And this week's is that a German battleship was cruising through the Thames, and the commander apparently gets the opportunity to pick whatever music he or she blazes out on the loudspeaker. So this particular commander chose the Imperial March from Star Wars, which made me chuckle, the idea of a German battleship just cruising through, doing their practice and their manoeuvres as Londoners confusingly listen to the sound of the Imperial March. So my question is, if you could be that commander and choose any song you wanted, what would you go for? I'll go first to give you guys a few seconds to think. I thought about this, and originally I thought, do I want to go something sort of just with London in the title? And then I thought, do you know what? Going Underground is what I was going to pick as the song, because I feel like I spend half my life in the underground anyway. But I also think it would probably confuse Londoners quite extremely that a German battleship is talking about going underground. So that was my slightly bizarre. It sounded funny in my head, but it doesn't sound as funny actually when I say it out loud. Ben, please save me from this train wreck of an attempted bit of humour. What's your choice?
Well, first song that came into my head was I'm Shipping Up to Boston by the Dropkick Murphys. But the fact that I'm on a battleship in the middle of London and I'm a peaceful gentleman, I'll just choose Sailing Away by Enya and peacefully remove myself from the situation.
You know what? That's much better than mine. You didn't even have that long to think about it. I've had like the whole morning to think about it, and I've absolutely failed there.
Yeah.
Andrea, what would you choose?
Oh, that's so easy for me because I'm a huge techno fan. That's basically all I listen to, European techno in general. So my favorite one would be Interstellar by Victor Ria. It's kind of a really cool techno song because that just gives me the vibes all the time. Don't know if it's appropriate for Battleship, but that's my choice.
You certainly would be confusing the Londoners with your European techno. Let's talk about your report. But before we do that, a little bit of background on yourselves might be a good idea. Ben, do you want to kick us off? Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and then also a little bit about Vizia as well, because I'm sure many people have heard of Vizia, but just in case there's one or two that haven't.
Yeah, sure. So Ben Harris, I lead our go-to-market teams in EMEA. I've been with the business for about 2 years. Before that, I was supporting different companies in setting up their employee listening strategy. So Vizia, we're a technology platform that supports our organizations across a wide range of activities to enable workforce intelligence, from people analytics to workforce planning to skills development. Ultimately, our goal is to help companies understand what's the impact of my people on business outcomes, and then what's the impact of the business on our people. We give everyone insights to help them make informed decisions around that as a key mission strategy.
Andrea,
Yeah, like you said, Chris, my title is Principal Researcher for Visio. I've been with Visio about 3 years. I spent 15 as a researcher in organizational and HR backgrounds. What I like best about working for Visio is we get to work with a lot of people, analytics experts, customers and non-customers, data scientists at Visio, and I get to work with a lot of HR professionals to make meaningful insights out of the data that they have.
Let's just talk about the report. I've got a few questions having read through the report, which I'll quiz you guys on. But before we do that, if you can maybe do a 1-minute overview as to the report itself, why you guys wrote the report, the reasons behind it, and then we'll get into the detail.
The reason we did the study was we surveyed about 400 people managers. We wanted to understand how much access they currently have to people data as they're making their everyday people decisions. We also wanted to know their perspective around Gen AI and how useful they think it's going to be for their everyday work with people with productivity, driving performance. And so we were really surprised at the level of enthusiasm for both the data itself. People really want people data, but also the Gen AI component. The main inspiration that people managers are expecting to get from Gen AI is really to boost productivity and to simplify data. And so that's what they expect of Gen AI, which really means that there's a big mandate for CHROs to invest in AI tools for manager effectiveness to make their lives easier, to help them be more efficient.
So let's talk, Andrew, a little bit, because it's broken down into sections, and you guys have come up with some interesting headline topics within it. The first one is managers crave more people data, because at a time when managers are under pressure to do a lot of things, there's a lot of systems you have to work with. There's a lot of processes you have to deliver. There's much talk about productivity. You've got organizations that are hybrid working. There's so many different component parts of being a line manager these days that the idea of them craving, the initial thought when I thought about this was the idea of them craving more data. Is it just another thing into the pile? But actually, I'd like you to just reflect on how crucial it is to help them support rather than just be another thing layered on that I've got to then look at and analyze. Can I get some thoughts from you about how crucial people data is for managers, particularly those with greater number of direct reports?
The way you frame the question really hits the main point. The complexity of today's management, we're all aware of that. You've just outlined that a little bit. And we saw in a different study recently that not a lot of people actually want to be managers these days, because it's become so complex, because of all the remote work environment, now the Gen AI, the skill building, the management itself, the component is always difficult. So let's make their lives easy. I think the data points that we identified in this report, that most of people managers that we asked really want people data. Why do they want people data? Because it helps them become more confident. They don't have to rely on their gut feeling all the time. It's really taxing if you have to think about so many things every day. And then you lack the data for certain decision making on who to hire, who to promote, for example. What's the performance of this employee? Can I really give them this particular project? There's so many data points they really have to process every day. So I think the way they express their need to have some help, technology or data, is really expressed in the fact that 96% of them told us they want people data to make better decisions. But the crucial thing is, our perspective, of course, from Visio is they don't need those data points next week or next month. They need them today or at the next leadership meeting. So being able to go into a business meeting with their own bosses, with their own business leaders, and having both people and business data ready at hand is critical.
And what's interesting about it as well, so there's that part of it, which is presenting to my line manager and presenting to the leadership team, but it's also the value in terms of my own team as well. So it's the performance management side of it and the value in there. Ben, can I just grab some thoughts from you around how managers should be using this people data when we're talking about that performance management process? And I think what's important here, and I'd love to get your reflections on it, is that you don't want to over rely on it too much, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You ask any manager, can you lead your team? Can you lead your business just on data alone without any of your human layered input? Forget it. Absolutely not. But the key point that Andrea raises previously is there is incredible demand from managers for this support. The rationale is they are overwhelmed and fundamentally they want to do their people justice, given what we have at our fingertips now to enable management of individuals for the best of them at a personal level, but also for the company. That's why that demand exists, is to really enable people managers to do their jobs effectively. Should it be an intrinsic part of their decision-making process? Absolutely. People think, well, kind of the performance management review process is one area where there's a kind of deep dive on the data with an HR business partner, but the way of work and the fluidity of workforce that you're managing is too rigid a process. This is always on. So being able to give managers that kind of real-time data to support their daily, weekly decisions, that's critical. And I know we're going to come onto it, but the Gen AI element to that is going to also transform just that type of engagement level for managers and what they're going to be demanding from central teams in terms of this type of data availability.
Do you know what's really interesting? Apologies to you both, but I'm a big football fan, so I'm going to make a football reference. When I listen to other podcasts, Arsenal podcasts, I think, but I listen to one podcast and they often talk about data is important from a footballing perspective and selecting the team, but actually you can't dismiss the eye test sometimes, but also you can't dismiss the intangible factors. Will this player, do they have the mentality to operate within the team that I've got? Yes, they've got all the right metrics, they've got all the right stats, but there's also the intangibles that I need to work with as well. Andrew, just before we go on to the next section, there were some other interesting stats there. Could you just reflect, just for our listeners, a couple of the really interesting stats around hiring and promotion to give a flavour that's in the report?
We wanted to know what do managers actually expect from people data? Where do they see the biggest benefits? Having more access, better access, or faster access to data about their teams and their employees. And so we found that the main expectation they have revolves around hiring decisions and promotion decisions. 67% of them want to have more data to support those decisions. They want to know more about their teams when they make a promotion decision. For example, who in the team has done more or less training to build more skills voluntarily? Who has some compliance hits and misses? Who has, for example, risk of exit? Do we know who is more likely to leave next? These are data points that many people managers really want to understand more about their team. I spoke to a large American bank, and the leadership development professional told me that the main concern of their managers was they just don't know how their people are doing. That seems such a trivial question, but I think that's sometimes really hard, particularly through the remote environment. So hiring decisions, promotion decisions is top of mind. The other one is really improved employee engagement. I know, Ben, you've worked in the listening space for a while. Our data told us that 52% of the people managers we asked want to see improved employee engagement. And for that, data is really helpful. We have customers who give access to thousands of people managers to the platform. They can look up their own NPS score. They can, for example, look up their own scores, how they're doing around speaking up or, cultural items. So that's really valuable for people managers to get this sense of where is my team, where is my business unit, how are they feeling about working here? And so that's the data they miss the most.
It's about empowering these individuals to be able to deliver and to support their employees and to have access to that information. It has such a powerful effect. And this is an interesting bit, which I'll lead into the second point. And Ben, I'd love to get your take on this, which is current access to people data is too superficial and disconnected. From my perspective, I find that quite interesting. I want to get your reflections on how much this impacts the trust of people managers across the organization.
Yeah, what does superficial mean when we're talking through data as a program? I think there's two aspects to it, Chris. The first is credibility and trust. For the managers that are receiving the data, does it line up to what they're seeing within their organization? I think from an HR perspective, there's been quite a lot of effort focused on that type of metric standardization, that type of data accuracy. So that's one element that always needs a good amount of focus to make sure that trust isn't broken at manager level. But then the second part outside of credibility is relevancy. So it's for the data that we're providing to our manager community, is it relevant to the problems that they're trying to solve? Or is it disconnected and we've missed the bridge between HR and the business? For a lot of our customers, we're doing a project with an engineering company. It's how do we make their people data program relevant to managers and the business? They love all the headcount metrics, all the typical HR metrics that they receive. But fundamentally, they want to understand what is the right composite of each of my engineering project teams. How should I think about the cost of those projects and how does that cost then change the different types of customer satisfaction, lifetime value of that customer, etc. And that's the frontier that we're really seeing pushed by a lot of the forward-leading brands, is HR becoming much more embedded within the business to create much more specific programs for the business divisions that they're supporting versus having these group data programs and divisional siloed programs where it's almost a cottage industry of them running their own data programs. So that credibility in the first instance, massively important, but then relevance to make sure it's having impact is also critically important in our view.
I think you're absolutely spot on there. The words, the phrases that were coming into my head there as you were talking there is talking to the rest of the business and the business saying, okay, but how does it impact me? How are you going to tell the story that's going to help me and my job and improve my life? You have to make it real for people, right? You can't have metrics for metrics' sake because people just won't use the information. They won't use the data. It becomes a tick box exercise and it doesn't help the brand of team delivering to you, the HR teams, the people analytics teams. So Andrea, from your perspective, how much do you think HR or people analytics teams are responsible for raising that internal brand of how to use people data more effectively?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Chris. I'm going to give you two contrasting points of view here. The first one is we know from countless examples from companies that have been really successful in building a data-informed culture that the mandate has to come from the top. We as HR professionals and people analytics teams are always responsible to raise a certain brand. I'm responsible for creating the research brand within Visier. Ben's responsible for creating his own brand of his team. But put that aside, with something like people analytics, when we consider how far behind some organizations are with building a people and business data-oriented brand, you need a strong leader at the top who is saying, we want to move away from making gut feeling decisions about our business and our people. We want to be a 21st century company. We want to make data-driven decisions. Why? Because you need collaboration between a large number of stakeholders in the business, within HR plus the business, that need wider commitment than just one siloed team. You need a people analytics function, somebody who's responsible for people analytics. Of course, you need the technology, the data infrastructure. But most of all, I think you need a willingness and a real commitment from the top to be all in. Have I seen grassroots efforts where specific, it's tiny or individuals or tiny teams, people analytics trying to build that brand by themselves? Sure, they can. Usually they start with one particular pilot, one problem that they're solving with data to try to show the value. It's just harder and it's probably going to take longer.
As a marketeer, I do find it fascinating. This isn't really a people analytics or a HR question. The lack of understanding of the importance of that internal brand profile raising helps you get to where you want to get to. You need to be able to articulate. You need to be able to sell your story and tell your story to make an impact and make success. I do find that fascinating, but I'm conscious of time and we've got a few more bits we need to get through. And Ben, you mentioned it earlier about the Gen AI piece. I think this is quite an interesting one. Section 3, managers see generative AI as a solution to current decision-making challenges. Let's just have a quick chat about that. So I guess the kickoff question is more around how managers use AI in performance management. Can you talk us through a little bit of that for our listeners?
It's a huge topic and it is fundamentally changing the game. The first point you hit on is there is a huge amount of appetite for managers to start using Gen AI. The second kind of statistic, which we found interesting, is just the frequency at which they intend to use it. So, over a third of the community, their anticipation is that this will be a daily tool. If you think about the significance of that in ways of working, it's enormous. It's going to require a lot of concentration and thought in terms of the strategy for each of these organizations to take it to market and disseminate it across their companies. I think the first thing is the changing dynamic of giving managers and the broader community easy access to the answers that matter. So within the flow of their work, they have a new assistant which can easily surface the things that matter to reduce that friction barrier for data-led decision-making. And then on the performance review element that you mentioned, Chris, there's different dynamics. So it can be just being able to spread out and get more data back around the individual through the Gen AI tool. We see a lot of customers using it to support them with best practice around writing performance reviews in a constructive and thoughtful way, best practice recommendations in terms of how to communicate potentially to an underperformer, as well as supporting kind of skill suggestions for development, career path, etc. So there's a number of different dynamics. There's a high appetite within the business to use this type of tooling. And then the way that we're working with customers is what's the right sequence of use cases that we should be supporting you on and creating a wrapper around to make sure that, again, back to that credibility point, we're delivering a technology that's trusted and used to value. And so that's a big part of our work through our services team as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic. And the reason why it's interesting is because depending on the type of business you work for, depending on the person you are as well, like how comfortable you are in really leaning into Gen AI, or if this is something that you think, I know that it could help me with my productivity. And I know that perhaps there is areas that I can look at and I can talk to the guys at Visio to support me. If I'm somebody that's listening here as a line manager, is there one thing that I can do? Any kind of tips that you could give to anybody? Ben's given a few really good examples. If there's one thing that you can take away from this in terms of how you're interactive with Gen AI, how it can be that solution making, is there any quick sort of snippet that you could leave our listeners with?
There's one top tip that we'd like to communicate is you have to try it out. Use Gen AI as some assistant that you're going to use for almost every task per day that you do, because it needs to be experimented with. It needs to be used because it will fail. Sometimes you will learn from every single failure. It will give you so much more valuable information that you would ever think of. It's very, very creative in its use. Why should you also just do it? Because you need to be a role model for your employees. If you want to build skills around using Gen AI to improve efficiency, productivity in your team, you're going to have to be the one to do it first and with them and for them. Upskilling the workforce, right? How does that work? There is no training program immediately that a company may have, but everybody can try and start using Gen AI tools, the open ones, for example, to get better at this. That's the only way to do that.
Yeah, that's a nice flavoured morsel you can leave our listeners with. I'm conscious we've probably got about 5 minutes left. We've got a couple more bits to go through. Managers aren't data scientists. Very good line to pull out there, which is kind of obvious. But Ben, I'd like to get just some reflections on this, particularly because our podcast is aimed, obviously, we get lots of chief people officers, chief human resources officers that listen to this, senior HR professionals. So can you give us a little bit of a flavour as to recommendations that you'd make to CHROs listening to this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's slightly provocative in terms of managers not being data scientists, but we do see a lot of fear which stops this data being democratized. So you've got this data demand on one side, and then central teams worried about how the data will be used and ingested because of data literacy, because of managers not being data scientists. So I think our key recommendation is around the insight design and talking the language of your business, and then trying to meet people where they are. And it comes back to the point that we made around the engineering company, which is the language they understand is around how to set up a project team cost effectively with the right people. So when you're driving that democratization of data, how are you matching that to their known language? If we're thinking about democratization of data, it comes back to relevancy and meeting people where they are. And over time, we can upskill that, we can evolve that. Often we see those managers starting to demand more breadth, more sophistication, and that's how we can further evolve the programs as we go.
I really like that. So there's an element of that you're telling the story, you're using data to tell the story, but you've also got to tell the story in the language that the listener is actually going to understand, so they can think, okay, now I can apply this to the way I work. Let's move on to section 5. And Andrea, I'd love to get just a bit of thoughts from you here, which was, without easy and reliable access to people data, managers are forced to rely on their instincts. This is an interesting one because I mentioned earlier, I'm going to do it again, I referenced my football reference, which is kind of like use data to tell part of the story, but you've also got to do the eye test. Conversely, if you don't have enough data, or if it's not provided in the right format and you're just on the eye test, again, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop the football analogies because it's a bit unfair, but I guess my question is more, how does CHROs, if you're a CHRO listening to this, get the balance right? How do I bridge the gap between, I'm just going to overload my guys with data, I don't want them to rely on it though, but also I don't want them to just go on gut feel all the time? Can I get some thoughts from you?
think it's a mindset switch that we need to do. We are supposed to approach data with intuition. They are not opposites on one continuum, in my view. Even though I'm a researcher, I think CHROs particularly are bridging so many people-related functions. So the need for data around those functions is critical. I mean, clearly we've discussed it throughout this podcast today, because who to hire, who promote should not be a matter of gut feeling, right? Guessing our women representation in senior leadership cannot be guesswork. Thinking that we know who our high performers are cannot be guesswork. I'm not saying that experience doesn't matter or intuition doesn't matter, but we should approach data with our own sense of the context of the organization, how much we know about people, and how we trust our people. So it's a really beautiful example of how we need to combine our intuition and how to use our intuition in the best way to approach the data that we have in front of us.
Yeah, 100%. And then the sixth section, which we kind of touched on a little bit already, Ben, because you've talked about that democratization piece. But I guess just as we wrap up today, can you give us a reflection or two on that final section, perhaps build on what you've already talked about the importance of prioritizing data democratization?
Yeah, it comes back to the why, Chris. Like, what are the behavior and actions we're trying to change within an organization? And how does data support that through its democratization? That's an example of why we partner with Lace Partners to help organizations understand that why, understand the purpose, the business case, and the value that can be generated around it. Once we've understood that North Star strategy, we've understood the different stakeholder demands from COEs within HR to business heads. That will help formulate the real drive behind why that democratization is so important.
Brilliant. Andrea, to wrap us up before we clock off for today's podcast, any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Ideally, an organization has the objective to provide access to people data with the goal to make managers' lives easier so that they can make more decisions faster, with more confidence, can have better discussions and conversations with team members. I think that needs to be the goal. Data can't be complicated, doesn't need to be presented in a way that it's hard to understand. I think that is the main goal, to make managers and HR managers' lives easier.
If you are listening to this and you want to download the report, honestly, do download the report. It's really, really interesting one. There's some great data in there, some fascinating insights from the guys. Please reach out to both Ben or Andrea if you want to chat with them. The best place to do it is via LinkedIn, Ben?
Yeah, LinkedIn's great.
If you want to get in touch with us about any of the discussion points today, you can do that as well. It's been really fascinating talking to you guys. This is a topic which is the whole kind of data piece around and the impact of AI and democratization of data, particularly as you talked about using it to tell the story. We're having lots of conversations with businesses about it. I know you guys are as well. Ben, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Chris.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Andrea, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Of course, you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can also see our back catalogue on lacepartners.co.uk/podcast. Other than that, from myself, from Ben and from Andrea, thank you very much for listening. And hopefully we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.